A suburban mother walked into a televised courtroom expecting justice for an $800 fence dispute. But after her children were humiliated on camera, she uncovered a secret recording that threatened to bring down the most powerful TV judge in America. Powerful. Before watching this shocking courtroom case review, make sure you subscribe to the channel first. Comment below where you're watching this video from and subscribe for more powerful justice stories like this. Powerful. Now let's begin and see how one mother's fight for her children turned into a battle against an entire television empire. She did it. Soccer mom Karen Mitchell did the one thing nobody in daytime television believed was possible. Powerful. She took on the most feared courtroom personality in America and exposed a secret recording that the network had allegedly tried to keep buried for 3 years. At first, powerful. People thought Karen was just another angry parent who could not accept losing on television. A mother embarrassed in front of millions. A woman upset because a judge had spoken harshly to her family. Powerful. A small-town parent trying to blame someone else for a bad day in court. But that was not the truth. Karen Mitchell was not fighting because she lost an $800 dispute. She was fighting because of what happened to her children. Powerful. After Judge Judith humiliated Karen's son and daughter on national television, Karen digging. What she found was not just one cruel courtroom moment, it was a hidden pattern, a system. Powerful. A machine built around turning vulnerable families into entertainment and then silencing them when the damage became too obvious to ignore. The secret audio recording did more than damage the judge's public image. Powerful. It raised questions about what producers knew, what the network allegedly covered up, and how many families had been emotionally broken for ratings, while viewers at home believed they were watching justice. Powerful. What Karen eventually uncovered would change everything people thought they knew about America's most trusted television courtroom. It began at 3:17 a.m. My phone exploded with notifications, emergency legal briefing, criminal charges filed. Powerful. Network stock crashing. I was sitting in my car outside the federal courthouse, rain pounding against the windshield, staring at documents I never thought I would see in real life. For months, we had been following the Karen Mitchell case. Powerful. At first, it looked like a simple small claims dispute, the kind of case into daytime television history after one episode. A soccer mom from Ohio, an $800 fence disagreement, a neighbor conflict. Powerful. And a televised courtroom where the outcome was supposed to be quick, emotional, and forgettable. Karen Mitchell was supposed to lose, cry, and disappear. That was how the system worked. People came in with ordinary problems. They were judged. Powerful. Mocked, corrected, and then edited into entertainment. Most of them never had the power, money, or courage to fight back afterward, but Karen did not disappear. Instead, powerful. She found something that would shake the foundation of the entire courtroom television industry. 6 months earlier, Karen had walked into that studio believing she was about to receive justice. She was a 42-year-old mother from Ohio. Powerful. Involved in what seemed like a minor $800 fence dispute with her neighbor. She brought her 2 children with her, Emma, age 12, and Jake, age 15, because the court show's staff allegedly told her it would be educational for them. Powerful. They said the kids would learn how real justice worked, but what happened inside that courtroom did not feel like justice, it felt like public destruction. Judge Judith did not simply rule against Karen. Powerful. She tore into her in front of the cameras, the audience, and her children sitting only a few feet away. She called Karen a pathetic excuse for a mother. She suggested her children should feel ashamed. Powerful. She turned a small fence dispute into a personal attack on Karen's worth as a parent. Emma began sobbing. Jake dropped his head into his hands, unable to look up, but the judge was not finished. Powerful. She pointed toward the children and delivered the words that would stay with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. Look at your mother, kids. This is what failure looks like. Powerful. Remember this moment so you don't grow up to be disappointments like her. The studio audience laughed. The cameras kept rolling, and Karen Mitchell sat there frozen. Powerful. Watching her children's faces collapse under the weight of humiliation that should never have been aimed at them. In that moment, something inside her changed. She was not thinking about the fence anymore. Powerful. She was not thinking about the $800 anymore. She was not thinking about winning or losing the case. She was thinking about Emma's tears and Jake's shame. Then Karen stood up, looked directly into the judge's cold eyes, powerful, and said 5 words that would eventually change everything. You just made a mistake." At the time, the room treated it like an emotional outburst from a defeated mother. The audience murmured. The cameras captured it. Powerful. Producers likely assumed it would become another dramatic clip, but they did not understand what those words meant. Karen was not threatening revenge. She was making a promise. That night, Karen could not sleep. Powerful. Her daughter cried in her arms for hours, asking whether the judge was right. Jake refused to come out of his room. Powerful. The same children who had been brought there to learn about justice had instead learned what it felt like to be publicly shamed by an adult with power. Karen held Emma close and told her one thing again and again. Powerful. Mama is going to make this right. But the deeper Karen looked, the more disturbing the story became. She began searching court forums, old complaints, sealed settlement rumors, powerful, and discussion boards where former guests whispered about their experiences. What she found suggested that her family was not the first to be destroyed in that courtroom, not even close. Powerful. Karen discovered stories from parents who said their children had suffered after appearing on the show. Families who claimed they were mocked, shamed, and emotionally broken on camera. Powerful. People who had tried to complain but were allegedly met with legal threats, settlement agreements, or silence that looked too consistent to ignore. Vulnerable families. Single parents struggling households. Powerful. Children already under pressure. Cases chosen not because they needed justice, but because they had emotional breaking points. Karen began to suspect that these families had not been accidentally harmed by a harsh television moment. Powerful. She began to believe the emotional damage was part of the formula. According to what she later alleged, vulnerable families were being selected because breakdowns produced ratings. Tears created clips. Powerful. Children crying on camera created viral moments. Public humiliation became a business model disguised as tough justice. The network knew, Karen believed the producers knew, and according to the files she would later uncover, powerful. Even staff members had raised concerns before those concerns were buried under legal pressure. By sunrise, Karen Mitchell was no longer crying. She was planning. She did not call gossip websites. She did not post emotional accusations online. Powerful. She did not try to become famous overnight. Instead, she walked into the law offices of Williams & Associates with $47,000 in cash, every penny of her children's college fund, and a recording device hidden inside her purse. Powerful. Because Karen had one advantage the studio never expected. Ohio is a one-party consent state, and Karen had recorded the behind-the-scenes conversation that happened before the cameras started rolling. That conversation, she believed, powerful, proved the family's destruction had not been spontaneous. It was not just one judge losing patience, it was a production strategy. Karen sat across from her attorney, Sarah Williams, and placed the recording device on the desk. Powerful. Sarah expected an emotional client. Instead, she found a mother whose fear had turned into focus. Karen looked her lawyer in the eye and said, "I don't want money. I don't want an apology. I want her held accountable." Powerful. "And I want every family she has hurt to see her fall." Sarah tried to slow her down. She explained that taking on a powerful television judge was not simple. This was not an ordinary defamation claim. The judge had lawyers. Powerful. The network had lawyers, the production company had contracts, and almost every participant had signed documents limiting what they could say later. "You can't just sue one of television's most powerful judges," Sarah warned. Powerful. Karen reached into her purse, pulled out the recording device, and pressed play. The voice that came through the speaker was not the calm, authoritative courtroom figure that viewers knew from television. It was harsher, colder, powerful, more calculating. The recording allegedly captured a producer discussing how to maximize the emotional impact of the family's appearance, how the children's reactions would make the segment stronger, powerful, and how Karen's vulnerability could be used to push the episode into unforgettable television. Sarah Williams stopped taking notes. She just listened, because what she was hearing did not sound like a normal production meeting. Powerful. It sounded like a plan to break a family on camera for entertainment value. By the time the audio ended, Sarah understood that Karen's case was much bigger than one humiliating episode. This was not just defamation. Powerful. This was not just emotional distress. This was evidence that could support claims of intentional psychological harm, exploitation of minors, and a broader conspiracy to profit from family trauma while presenting it as justice. Karen Mitchell, powerful, a suburban mother from Ohio, had walked into that office with a hidden recording and a promise to protect her children. Powerful. But what she had in her hands could become the beginning of a legal war against one of the most powerful television institutions in America. And if anyone believed one mother could not challenge an empire, powerful, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were, because the recording was only the beginning. What Karen would uncover next would take her far beyond her own family's pain and into a hidden archive of complaint settlements, powerful, and broken children who had allegedly suffered the same kind of damage. What Karen's lawyer heard on that recording made her physically sick. It was not only the cruelty of the words, it was the confidence behind them. Powerful. The voices on the recording did not sound like people worried about fairness, dignity, or the emotional safety of two children sitting in a courtroom audience. They sounded like people building a television moment. Powerful. Measuring a family's pain as if it were nothing more than content, the recording suggested that the humiliation Karen's children experienced had not been an accident. It had been prepared, planned, encouraged, and for Sarah Williams, powerful, that changed the entire legal picture. At first, she had thought Karen might have a strong emotional distress case, maybe a defamation claim, maybe an argument that the show had gone beyond the bounds of ordinary courtroom commentary. Powerful. But after hearing that audio, Sarah realized the situation was far deeper. If the production team had deliberately targeted the children's reactions, if they had planned to break the family for entertainment, powerful, then this was not just a harsh judge saying cruel things on camera. This could be evidence of a system that turned vulnerable families into ratings. But the recording was only the first door Karen opened. Powerful. Behind that door was something far darker. 3 days after Karen hired her legal team, a young CBS intern named Marcus Rodriguez made what would become the most consequential mistake of his career. At 11:47 p.m., powerful, he accidentally sent the wrong attachment to Sarah Williams's email. It was supposed to be a routine production document, a scheduling file, a harmless administrative item connected to Karen's appearance. Powerful. But what landed in Sarah's inbox was not routine. It was an 847-page confidential file labeled with Judge Judy-style liability history. Sarah opened it expecting paperwork. Instead, she found a map of silence. The document contained complaints. Powerful. Lawsuits, internal warnings, settlement summaries, and desperate pleas from families who claimed they had been emotionally destroyed after appearing on the show. It was not one angry family. It was not two. Powerful. It was page after page of similar stories, each one carrying the same terrible structure. A vulnerable family appeared on television. A child was humiliated. The clip spread. The child suffered. The family complained. The network settled. Powerful. Then everything disappeared behind a non-disclosure agreement. The first file Karen read made her blood run cold. It involved the Henderson family from Michigan. They had appeared on the show in 2016 over a $600 car repair dispute. Powerful. During the episode, Judge Judith allegedly called their 10-year-old daughter stupid like her mother. At first, CBS treated it as a sharp courtroom moment, the kind of line viewers replay, laugh at and share. But 3 weeks later, powerful, the little girl attempted suicide by swallowing her mother's anxiety medication. According to the file, children at school had replayed the clip again and again. They called her TV stupid. They mocked her in hallways. Powerful. They repeated the judge's words until the child began to believe them. The family sued CBS for $2.3 million. So the case never reached public trial. Sealed the records. Powerful. And forced the family to sign an NDA that threatened financial ruin if they ever spoke publicly about what had happened. Karen kept reading. The Hendersons were not alone. There was the Kowalski family from Texas. Powerful. Their 13-year-old son reportedly developed severe social anxiety after Judge Judith called him a future burden on society during a 2018 episode. Before the show, he had been shy but functional. Afterward, according to the records, powerful. He stopped attending school regularly, avoided public places, and panicked whenever classmates mentioned the clip. There was the Nguyen family from California. Their teenage daughter had defended her immigrant parents during a dispute. Powerful. Only to be humiliated on national television. The file said she later began harming herself and required intensive treatment after the episode aired, and strangers online mocked her accent, her family and her tears. Case after case followed. Powerful. Different states, different families, different small disputes. But the same pattern repeated again and again. Children were shamed on camera. Parents were humiliated in front of them. The episodes aired, the clips spread. Powerful. The damage followed, then CBS paid settlements and demanded silence. Karen read for 3 straight hours, tears running down her face. Every page felt like another family sitting where her family had sat. Powerful. Another child hearing words from an authority figure and wondering if those words were true. Another parent trying to hold a broken child together after television turned their pain into entertainment at 2:30 a.m. Powerful. Karen picked up the phone and called Sarah. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sarah?" she said. "How many families has she destroyed?" For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. The silence on the phone felt heavier than any answer. Finally, powerful. Sarah spoke, and her voice cracked. "Karen, there are 237 documented cases in this file alone, and this only goes back to 2015. By Monday morning, Karen's investigation uncovered something even more disturbing. Powerful. Internal CBS emails suggested that the emotional damage was not merely something producers tolerated after the fact. According to those emails, the emotional collapse of families appeared to be part of the show's business strategy. Powerful. One 2019 email from a program executive named David Chen to the production team discussed ratings patterns. The message said that episodes involving family breakdowns produced major spikes in viewership and engagement. Powerful. It encouraged staff to prioritize cases involving vulnerable children because emotional reactions created stronger clips and better quarterly numbers. The wording was cold, clinical, corporate. Powerful. As if children crying on television were simply a metric. Then came the response that made Karen's hands shake. Judge Judith had allegedly replied, "Don't worry about the brats. Their trauma pays for my Bentley." Powerful. Karen stared at that line until the words blurred. She wanted to believe it was fake. She wanted to believe no adult, especially no judge, could look at children's pain and describe it like a business expense. But the email was there. Powerful. Timestamped, archived, attached inside a confidential file that never should have reached her lawyer. The smoking gun came from an unexpected witness. Officer Patricia Martinez, a former bailiff on the show, Powerful, had been quietly gathering evidence for 5 years before she was fired for what the network described as attitude problems. In a sworn affidavit described what she had seen behind the scenes. According to her, Powerful, Judge Judith kept a private notebook rating families based on what she called their destruction potential. Families with shy children received higher ratings because they were easier to break emotionally. Powerful. Single mothers were preferred because they were less likely to have the money or legal support to fight back after the episode aired. Most disturbing of all, Powerful. Martinez claimed that casting staff were encouraged to find families already dealing with stress, anxiety, grief, divorce, or mental health struggles because their emotional collapse looked more real on camera. Powerful. Karen could barely breathe as she read the affidavit. Martinez described one boy, 14 years old, who had broken down during commercial breaks. Instead of comforting him, the affidavit claimed Judge Judith pushed him harder. Powerful. Telling him his father was probably ashamed of him. When the boy cried more deeply after cameras resumed, Martinez said the judge high-fived a producer and called it Emmy-worthy's. Martinez wrote that she knew she was watching abuse. Powerful. But she also knew what happened to spoke too loudly. CBS's legal department had made it clear, according to the affidavit, that speaking out meant losing her job, facing legal destruction. Powerful, and possibly being blamed for violating confidentiality rules. The final piece of the early investigation came from Dr. Amanda Foster, a child psychologist who had quietly treated victims of the show for over a decade. Powerful. After seeing early news coverage of Karen's case, Dr. Foster reached out to Sarah Williams. Her files were devastating. In her clinical notes, Dr. Foster had documented 18 children who developed severe PTSD symptoms, depression, powerful, anxiety disorders, or appearing on the show or being directly referenced during episodes. 3 had attempted suicide. 12 had required residential psychiatric treatment. Many described the same core wound. Powerful. They had been humiliated by an adult authority figure in front of millions of people, and then the internet had kept the humiliation alive. For Karen, those notes were unbearable because every file reminded her of Emma and Jake. That night, powerful, she sat at the kitchen table with both of her children while the house stayed quiet around them. She did not show them every detail. She did not want to frighten them more than they already were. But Emma saw the papers. She saw her mother's face. Powerful. She knew other children had been hurt too. Emma looked up with tears in her eyes. "Mummy," she asked, "why did all these other kids have to hurt too?" Karen pulled her daughter close. Her voice was soft, powerful, but something in it had changed forever. "Baby," she said, "they hurt because nobody was strong enough to stop her. But Mama is going to make sure she never hurts another child again." Karen did not know it yet. Powerful. But the investigation had already reached the judge's inner circle, and once Judge Judith realized that Karen was not backing down, she made the mistake that would give Karen the final evidence she needed. She tried to silence her. Powerful. Judge Judith's greatest weakness was not only her cruelty, it was her arrogance. For 28 years, she had been protected by power, contracts, network lawyers, sealed settlements, powerful, and a public image strong enough to make ordinary families feel helpless. She had watched parents cry, children collapse, and former guests disappear into silence after signing agreements they could not afford to challenge. Powerful. She had survived every complaint, every whisper, every buried lawsuit, every family that tried to speak and then got forced back into silence. So when Judge Judith discovered that Karen Mitchell was building a case against her, powerful, she did not react with fear at first. She reacted with confidence, the same confidence that had protected her for decades. She believed Karen was just another emotional mother who could be frightened, pressured, or bought. Powerful. Another parent who would eventually realize she was up against too much money, too much influence, and too many lawyers. That belief became Judge Judith's first real mistake. Powerful. She tried to silence Karen the same way others had allegedly been silenced before. It began with a phone call at 6:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Karen was in the kitchen making breakfast for Em and Jake when her phone rang. Powerful. The house was still quiet. The kids were getting ready for school. For one brief moment, it looked like an ordinary morning in a home still trying to recover from public humiliation. Then Karen answered. The voice on the other end was cold, powerful, polished and controlled. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Patricia Wells from Steinberg and Associates, Judge Judith's legal counsel. We need to discuss your recent activities." Karen's hand tightened around the phone. Her heart started pounding, powerful, but she kept her voice steady. "The lawyer know we're not, you're talking impressed. We know about your little sound investigation. We know about the files you obtained illegally. Powerful, and we know exactly how to make your life very, very difficult." Karen looked across the kitchen at her children. Emma was pouring cereal into a bowl. Jake was tying his shoes near the door. Powerful. They had no idea that the woman who had hurt them on television was now reaching into their home again through lawyers and threats. Karen took a slow breath. This time she did not cry, she listened. The threats escalated quickly. Powerful. Within 48 hours, Karen received a cease and desist letter ordering her to stop what it called harassment, return all confidential documents, destroy any recordings in her possession. Powerful. And sign an agreement promising not to contact former guests or discuss the case publicly. The letter was designed to scare her. It accused her of wrongdoing. It warned of financial ruin. It implied that if she continued, powerful, the network and Judge Judith's legal team would come after everything she owned. But Karen had already crossed a line inside herself. Fear no longer controlled her the way it once had. She had seen the complaints. Powerful. She had read the children's stories. She had heard the recording, and now she understood that staying quiet would not protect her children. It would only protect the people who hurt them, but Judge Judith was not satisfied with legal pressure. Powerful. According to Karen's later filings, the intimidation became personal. That Friday, Karen received a call from Emma and Jake's school principal, Mrs. Anderson. Her voice was tense and careful. "Karen, I don't know what is happening." Powerful. But someone contacted the school claiming to be connected to Child Protective Services. They were asking for Emma and Jake's psychological evaluation records. Karen went cold. The principal continued. Powerful. "They said they were investigating whether your children were emotionally unstable. Something about building a record. I refused to release anything, but I thought you needed to know immediately. Karen stood silently in her kitchen, powerful, the phone pressed against her ear. This was no longer about legal documents. This was her children. Someone was trying to turn Emma and Jake's trauma into a weapon against their own mother. Powerful. The same children who had been humiliated on television were now being targeted behind the scenes. That moment changed Karen's resolve into something harder. She was no longer simply preparing a lawsuit. Powerful. She was protecting her family from a machine that had learned how to crush people quietly. Then came Judge Judith's biggest mistake. The following Monday, a courier arrived at Karen's door with a sealed envelope. Inside was a check for $500. Powerful. Susan and a pre-written non-disclosure agreement. The message was obvious. Take the money. Sign the agreement. Disappear. Powerful. But attached to the papers was a handwritten note that Karen would later describe as the moment Judge Judith destroyed herself. The note read, "Take the money and disappear, or I'll destroy your children the way I destroyed all the others." Powerful. Your choice. Karen read it once, then again. For a moment, the room seemed to disappear around her. It was not just a threat, it was an admission. Powerful. The words "the way I destroyed all the others" connected Karen's family to every other family in those files. It connected Emma and Jake to the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, the Nguyens. Powerful. And every child whose pain had allegedly been buried under settlement agreements and silence. Judge Judith had believed the note would terrify Karen into surrender. Instead, it became the evidence Karen had been waiting for. Powerful. Because Judge Judith had made one fatal miscalculation. Karen Mitchell was not like the families she had allegedly terrorized before. Karen was not isolated. Karen was not unprepared. Powerful. Karen was not willing to protect her own peace by abandoning other children to the same system. And most importantly, Karen had been recording every interaction since the first threatening call. Under Ohio's one-party consent law. Powerful. Karen had the legal right to record conversations in which she participated, especially when she believed she was being threatened. The phone calls, the intimidation, the school contact, the courier delivery, powerful, and the handwritten part of a growing evidence file. That night, Karen called Sarah Williams. Her voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the shock underneath. "Sarah," Karen said, "I have her on tape trying to buy my silence." Powerful, and I have a handwritten note threatening my children. She admitted she destroyed other families. The silence on the line stretched for several seconds. Then Sarah whispered, "Karen, she just handed us everything." Powerful. This was no longer just a civil lawsuit. This was no longer only about emotional distress or defamation. The alleged attempt to silence Karen, combined with the money, the threat, the recordings, and the documents, powerful, raised the possibility of criminal conduct. Extortion, witness intimidation, a coordinated cover-up, potential conspiracy across state lines. Sarah understood the danger immediately. If they filed only a civil case, the network could delay. Powerful. Fight, deny, and attempt to bury the matter the same way it had allegedly buried others. But if Karen had evidence of threats and attempted payoff, this had to go somewhere stronger. The next morning at 9 a.m., powerful, Karen Mitchell walked into the FBI field office in Cleveland. She was not dressed for cameras. She was not looking for attention. She carried a folder, a recording device, copies of the files, the handwritten note. Powerful. And the kind of quiet determination that comes only from a mother who believes her children are still in danger. Special Agent Maria Rodriguez took the first meeting. At first, she treated it carefully. Powerful. People came to federal offices every day with accusations against powerful figures. Some were real, some were confused. Some were personal disputes dressed as conspiracies. But as Karen began playing the recordings and laying out the documents, powerful, Agent Rodriguez's expression changed. She listened to the phone call. She reviewed the cease and desist letter. She read the handwritten note. Then she listened to the alleged behind-the-scenes production recording. The room grew very quiet. Powerful. Agent Rodriguez replayed one section twice. "This is not just a television dispute." Karen nodded. "I know." The agent continued, her voice now much more serious. "Powerful. This could be evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise if what you are showing me connects to prior settlements, intimidation, and a coordinated effort to silence victims." Karen placed the 8 and 47-page file on the table. "Powerful. There are 237 families in there. Within hours, the evidence began moving through federal channels. The claim was no longer simply that a judge had spoken cruelly on television. Powerful. The claim was that a powerful media operation had allegedly identified vulnerable families, exploited emotional damage for ratings, paid off victims, silenced them with NDAs, powerful, and then attempted to intimidate the one mother who refused to stay quiet. Federal investigators began requesting records, production documents, internal emails, settlement files, communications between the show, the network, and legal teams. Powerful. By the end of the day, warrants were being prepared not just for Judge Judith's records, but for production company materials and executive communications connected to the alleged cover-up. Powerful. The situation had moved from scandal to criminal investigation at 4:17 p.m., federal agents arrived at Judge Judith's Beverly Hills mansion. She was hosting a dinner party for Hollywood elites. Powerful. There were expensive cars outside, wine glasses on tables, and guests who had spent years praising her toughness as entertainment. None of them expected to see federal agents walk through the door. When Agent Rodriguez entered with the warrant, powerful, the room went silent. Judge Judith demanded to know what was happening. This time, nobody cared how powerful she sounded. Agent Rodriguez read the charges being investigated: extortion, racketeering, powerful, and conspiracy related to the alleged exploitation and intimidation of families. Then the handcuffs clicked. For the first time in decades, the woman who had made countless people tremble in a courtroom had no bench, no gavel. Powerful. No cameras under her control, and no producer whispering in her ear. News helicopters captured the scene from above as Judge Judith was escorted from her mansion in federal custody. America watched in disbelief. Powerful. The toughest judge on television, the woman who had built a career on exposing other people, was now the one being exposed, but the real bombshell came that evening. Powerful. Karen Mitchell held her first press conference with Emma and Jake standing beside her. She did not look triumphant. She looked exhausted, but her voice did not shake. She told the public that this was not just about her family. Powerful. It was about every child who had been humiliated, every parent who had been silenced, and every victim who had been told that speaking up would cost them everything. Then Karen revealed the private notes. According to the evidence she presented, powerful, Judge Judith had allegedly kept detailed records of the children she humiliated, emotional breakdowns, and tracking which techniques caused the most visible distress. Karen held up copied pages from the notebook. Powerful. The country watched in horror as the allegations became harder and harder to dismiss. For the first time, the woman America had known as a tough judge was being described not as strict, not as blunt, not as entertaining, powerful, but as someone who allegedly fed on children's pain for profit, and now she would have to answer for it in a real courtroom. For the first time in her life, Judge Judith sat in a real defendant's chair with no power over the room. Powerful. There was no television set built around her authority, studio audience waiting to laugh at her sharpest lines, no producers controlling the tone, no editing team to protect her image, no gavel in her hand. Powerful. No courtroom brand surrounding her like armor. This was federal court, and now she was the one being judged. The courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Reporters filled the hallways. Cameras waited outside. Powerful. Families who had stayed silent for years sat shoulder to shoulder in the gallery, many of them holding photographs, therapy records, medical bills, and documents they had once believed would never see daylight. Powerful. There were mothers who had watched their children change after appearing on television, fathers who had spent years paying for therapy, teenagers who still lowered their eyes whenever an authority figure raised a voice. Powerful. Parents who had signed NDAs because they were scared, broke, and told they had no chance against one of the most powerful names in television. But now they were not alone. They were in the same room, powerful, and they were watching the woman they believed had profited from their pain finally face a legal system she could not control. Karen Mitchell took the witness stand with quiet dignity. Powerful. She did not look like the same terrified mother who had once walked out of a television studio holding two broken children. Her voice was steady, her posture was calm, but every word carried the weight of what her family had endured. Powerful. She looked toward the judge, then toward the jury, and explained what had happened. She described the $800 fence dispute that had brought her family to the show. She described being told that bringing Emma and Jake would be educational. Powerful. She described sitting in that courtroom, expecting a lesson in justice, only to watch her children become targets of humiliation. Then she turned slightly and looked toward Judge Judith. "Your Honor," Karen said. Powerful. Judith did not just humiliate my children on television. She turned their trauma into profit. Then, when we tried to fight back, she tried to silence us with threats and money. Judge Judith's lawyer objected immediately. Powerful. His voice sharp and desperate. But the prosecution was allowed the testimony to continue because Karen's statement was not standing alone. It was supported by recordings, emails, internal records, affidavits. Powerful. And the handwritten note that had turned the case from civil outrage into federal prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming. Still, the hardest moment came when 13-year-old Emma Mitchell stepped forward to read her victim impact statement. Powerful. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Emma was small at the microphone. Her hands shook slightly as she unfolded the paper. Karen sat nearby, fighting tears but refusing to look at Jake sat beside her, his jaw tight. Powerful. Watching his sister do something no child should ever have to do. Emma's voice was soft when she began. "Judge Judy told me I was stupid on TV in front of millions of people. I believed her." Powerful. "I thought maybe I really was worthless because a judge said so." Several jurors lowered their eyes. Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. "But my mum taught me that real judges protect kids. They don't hurt them." Powerful. Tears moved through the jury box. People in the gallery quietly cried. Even some reporters stopped typing. Emma looked toward the defendant's table for the first time. "I hope she learns that kids have feelings too." Powerful. That sentence broke something in the courtroom, because behind all the legal language, all the charges, all the documents, and all the media attention, this wasn't true of the case. Children had been treated like props. Powerful. Their tears had allegedly been treated like ratings. Their shame had been edited into entertainment, and now one of those children was standing in a federal courtroom, asking to be seen as human. Powerful. Then came the evidence that broke Judge Judith completely. Prosecutor Sarah Chen stood and told the court she was about to play a private audio recording. The defense objected again, arguing context, authenticity, and prejudice. Powerful. But the recording had already been authenticated. The court allowed it. The room went silent. Then Judge Judith's own voice filled the courtroom. Powerful. The recording captured a private phone call in which she allegedly celebrated the emotional collapse of a child after the episode aired. Her tone was casual, almost amused, as she spoke about the damage like it was a successful ratings moment. Powerful. Then came the line that made the courtroom gasp. "Finally got rid of that little brat. Maybe now his parents will think twice before challenging me." A wave of horror moved through the room. Bockrants covered their mouths. Powerful. One father in the gallery began crying openly. Judge Judith lowered her head and buried her face in her hands as her own words echoed through the courtroom. For decades, she had used words as weapons against other people. Powerful. She had built a public identity around cutting through excuses and exposing weakness, but now her own words were being used against her, and there was nowhere to hide. The prosecution continued building the case piece by piece. Powerful. They presented the internal emails discussing ratings increases when family breakdowns occurred. They presented the alleged notebook entries rating families based on emotional vulnerability. They presented the former bailiff's affidavit. Powerful. They brought in Dr. Amanda Foster, who testified about children she had treated after their appearances on the show. Dr. Foster spoke carefully, professionally. Powerful. And with the seriousness of someone who had watched long-term harm unfold in therapy rooms far away from television cameras, she explained that children respond differently to public humiliation than adults. Powerful. A harsh comment from an authority figure can become internalized. When that comment is broadcast, clipped, mocked, and replayed online, the child can experience the humiliation again and again. She described anxiety, depression, school refusal. Powerful. Panic attacks, self-harm, post-traumatic symptoms. She did not speak for drama. She spoke from records, case histories, and years of clinical work with families who had once believed no one would listen. The jury listened. Powerful. And the courtroom changed. The defense tried to argue that television participants signed releases. They argued that the show was entertainment. They argued that blunt commentary was part of the judge's public style. Powerful. They argued that adults had consented to appear and that the network could not be responsible for every viewer reaction afterward. But the prosecution kept returning to one point. Children cannot be treated as collateral damage for ratings. Powerful. And if the evidence showed that emotional harm was not accidental but targeted, documented, encouraged, and protected through threats and settlements, then this was not just entertainment, it was exploitation. Powerful. Karen sat through every day of testimony. Sometimes she held Emma's hand, sometimes Jake held hers, sometimes closed her eyes as other parents described what had happened to their own children. Powerful. The Henderson family testified about their daughter's suicide attempt. The Kowalski family described years of anxiety and isolation. The Nguyen family spoke about their daughter's self-harm after online harassment connected to the episode. Powerful. One after another, families came forward. Some spoke quietly, some broke down, some were angry, but all of them shared the same message. They had thought they were alone until Karen refused to stay silent. Powerful. The jury deliberated for only 47 minutes. When they returned, the courtroom was so quiet that the sound of the door opening felt loud. Judge Judith sat motionless at the defense table. For the first time, powerful. She looked less like a media figure and more like a person who understood the final protection around her had fallen away. The foreman stood, his voice was firm. Guilty on all counts. The words hit the room like thunder. Powerful. Judge Judith collapsed into her chair as the verdict was read. Guilty of racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy connected to the alleged exploitation and intimidation of families. The sentence that followed was devastating. Powerful. 15 years in federal prison. The woman who had spent decades judging others was now sentenced by the system she thought she could outrun. Her fortune, built from years of televised authority, was no longer untouchable. Powerful. Her reputation was destroyed. Her empire was collapsing, and the families who had once watched her from the powerless side of the screen now watched her leave the courtroom in custody. But Karen did not cheer. She did not smile for cameras. Powerful. She hugged Emma and Jake and cried, because this was not victory in the ordinary sense, it was justice. And justice, after years of silence, felt heavier than celebrations. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions. Powerful. But Karen only gave a short statement. It was about protecting children. No show, no judge, no network, and no rating is worth a child believing they are worthless. Powerful. That statement became the emotional center of the movement that followed. Within hours, the verdict sent shockwaves through the entertainment industry. CBS stock dropped sharply as investors reacted to the criminal convictions. Powerful, the potential civil liability and the public outrage now spreading across the country within 48 hours. Powerful. The network announced the immediate cancellation of all court shows connected to the scandal and the termination of executives involved in the alleged cover-up. But Karen's fight had already grown beyond one show. Powerful. The Justice for Kids movement exploded across social media. Families who had remained silent for years began speaking publicly. Former reality TV participants from cooking competitions, talent shows, family programs. Powerful. And conflict-based series came forward with stories of pressure, manipulation, emotional harm, and contracts they said were designed to silence them. The conversation changed from one courtroom show to an entire industry. Powerful, and at the center of it all stood Karen Mitchell, the mother nobody had expected to fight back. The fall of Judge Judith did not end with the prison sentence. In many ways, that was only the beginning. When the gavel came down, powerful, an empire that had been protected for decades began collapsing in full view of the public. The same television brand that had once been treated as untouchable was suddenly toxic. Advertisers pulled away, executives went silent. Powerful. Lawyers began reviewing contracts, settlements, and non-disclosure agreements that had kept former guests quiet for years. CBS stock dropped sharply in after-hours trading as investors realized the scandal was not just about one judge. Powerful. It was about an entire production culture. Within 48 hours, the network announced the immediate cancellation of every courtroom program connected to the scandal. Executives tied to the alleged cover-up were terminated. Powerful. Production companies began emergency reviews of their own practices. The entertainment industry, which had once celebrated harsh humiliation as good television, now had to answer a much harder question. Powerful. How many vulnerable people had been turned into content? Karen Mitchell's victory sparked something much larger than a lawsuit. It became a movement. Across social media, the Justice for Kids movement spread with incredible speed. Powerful. Parents began sharing stories. Former reality TV participants came forward, people who had appeared on cooking competitions, talent shows, family conflict programs, powerful, and other reality-based productions began describing the pressure they faced behind the scenes. Some talked about producers pushing them to cry. Some described being manipulated into arguments. Powerful. Some said children were encouraged to react emotionally because emotional clips performed better online. For years, many of these people had stayed silent because of contracts, fear, embarrassment, or legal threats. Powerful. But Karen's case showed them something they had not believed before. A powerful television machine could be challenged, and it could lose. Emma and Jake Mitchell, the children who had once sat humiliated in a studio courtroom, powerful, became faces of a new child protection movement. Their pain had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into purpose. Emma started a non-profit called Kids Deserve Respect, powerful, designed to provide legal and emotional support for minors exploited or humiliated by television productions. The organization helped families understand contracts, access trauma counseling, powerful, and speak with advocates before allowing children to appear on camera. Jake took a different path. He began lobbying lawmakers. At only 17, he became one of the youngest people to testify before Congress about child protection in entertainment. Powerful. His testimony focused on one simple idea: children should never be used as emotional props for ratings. That testimony helped inspire the Mitchell Protection Act, a law requiring child advocates, psychological evaluations, powerful, and stricter oversight on any production where minors appear in emotionally sensitive situations. The law spread far beyond one state. Over time, versions of the protection model were adopted in multiple countries. Powerful. Networks were forced to place child psychologists and legal advocates on sets involving minors. Producers could no longer treat children as background material in adult conflicts. Powerful. Any production that included vulnerable minors now faced stronger rules, stronger reporting requirements, and real consequences for emotional exploitation. Karen had never planned to become the face of a national movement. Powerful. She had only wanted her children to feel safe again, but by refusing to stay silent, she had changed an entire industry. Judge Judy's fortune, once estimated in the hundreds of millions, powerful, was seized and redirected toward compensation for the documented victims. The money that had allegedly been built from children's tears was now used to fund therapy, education, legal aid, and recovery programs for families who had been harmed. Powerful. For many former victims, the money mattered. Therapy bills had drained savings. Legal fights had emptied accounts. Parents had lost jobs trying to care for children who could no longer function normally after public humiliation. Powerful. But the money was not the most important part. The most important part was being believed. Families who had spent years being told to stay quiet finally heard the world say their pain was real. Powerful. Children who had carried shame from viral clips finally saw the person who hurt them held accountable. Parents who thought they had failed their kids began to understand that they had been fighting a system designed to overpower them. Powerful. The Henderson family, whose daughter had attempted suicide after being mocked on television, started support groups for children traumatized by public media humiliation. Their daughter, powerful, once unable to walk through school without hearing cruel nicknames, began speaking privately to other children who had gone through similar pain. The Kowalski boy, who had suffered years of anxiety after his appearance, powerful, eventually graduated as valedictorian. He later chose to study child psychology, hoping to help young victims rebuild their self-worth after public shame. The Nguyen family became advocates for immigrant families in media spaces. Powerful, helping parents understand how quickly a language barrier of an emotional moment or cultural vulnerability could be exploited by producers looking for drama. One by one, the victims became voices, and those voices became too strong to silence. Powerful. 2 years later, Karen Mitchell stood in her kitchen making breakfast for Emma and Jake. Just like she had on the morning the threatening phone call first came. Powerful. But the woman standing at that counter was not the same woman who had once trembled under legal intimidation. Everything had changed. The scared, powerful, humiliated mother who once left a television studio holding 2 wounded children had become one of the most influential child advocates in America. Her children, once treated like props in someone else's courtroom performance, powerful, had become leaders in a movement built to protect millions of others. Emma, now 15, spoke before the United Nations Children's Fund about media exploitation of minors. Her speech was watched around the world. She stood calmly at the podium, powerful, no longer the crying child whose dignity had been stolen on television, but a young advocate with a message that reached parents, lawmakers, and media companies everywhere. She began with words that brought the room to tears. Powerful. My name is Emma Mitchell, and when I was 12 years old, a powerful adult tried to convince me I was worthless. But my mum taught me something that changed everything. No one has the right to steal a child's dignity, not even on television. Powerful. That sentence became one of the defining lines of the movement. Jake, now 17, continued pushing for stronger protections in law. Powerful. He told lawmakers that children do not fully understand what it means for a humiliating moment to live forever online. They do not understand contracts, edits, audience reactions, or viral cruelty. Powerful. That is why adults have a responsibility to protect them before damage happens, not after it becomes profitable. The Mitchell Protection Act became his family's legacy. Powerful. It ensured that children on television sets had advocates who did not work for the network, psychologists who could stop filming if emotional harm became visible, and legal guardians who understood the long-term impact of televised humiliation. Powerful. For the first time, ratings could not be used as an excuse for hurting children. Judge Judy, meanwhile, spent her final years in federal prison, stripped of the image that had once protected her. Powerful. The woman who had built an empire on being feared now lived under the authority of a system she could not command. Her legacy changed completely. She was no longer remembered as simply a tough judge or a blunt television personality. Powerful. She became a warning about what happens when entertainment forgets humanity, a warning about power without is a warning about adults who mistake children's pain for content. Powerful was never truly about Judge Judy. It was about a mother's refusal to let humiliation become the final chapter of her children's lives. Powerful. Karen had taken the worst moment her family had ever experienced and turned it into protection for others. She had taken Emma's tears, Jake's shame, and her own fear and transformed them into evidence, advocacy, legislation, and change. Powerful. That is what made her powerful. Not fame, not money, not television influence. Love, a mother's love, became stronger than network lawyers, sealed settlements, intimidation, and decades of silence. Powerful. The original fence dispute had been worth only $800, but the justice that followed was priceless. Karen Mitchell proved that ordinary people are not powerless when they stand on truth. Powerful. She proved that a parent protecting their child can challenge institutions that seem impossible to defeat. She proved that even the most powerful bullies can fall when one person refuses to stay quiet. And most importantly, powerful. She proved that children's dignity is not negotiable, not for ratings, not for entertainment, not for money, not for any show, judge, producer, or network. In the end, Emma and Jake were not broken by what happened to them. Powerful. They became part of the reason other children would be protected. Their pain became purpose. Their story, their family's courage became a shield for millions. And Karen Mitchell, the suburban soccer mom nobody thought could fight back, powerful, became the woman who changed television forever. Her story reminds every parent that silence protects the bully, but truth protects the child. And when love is stronger than fear, even the biggest empire can fall.